everyone. This is Dr. Monique Smith Gadson here with Transforming Visions Counseling and Consulting Services, where we are all about relationships, building, developing, strengthening, and restoring relationships. That is what we do. So thank you so much for tuning in again on today. I am going to do another segment on trauma. As I stated, I was going to start focusing Thursdays on talking and teaching about trauma because, as Dr. Diane Langberg has said, I've heard her say that trauma is the new mission field for the church. We have so many traumatic events that take place in our society. We have so much new information about how our brains process and respond to trauma. It's so much, and I think I would say personally that we're being negligent if we don't teach on trauma all the more. I said in my introduction video that I'm going to spend time talking about trauma simply because of the fact that I'm just becoming more burdened about it. As a therapist, of course, I sit with people who have experienced traumatic events on a regular basis. But lately, I've also been a part of experiencing more and more traumatic events. People that are close to me are experiencing traumatic events. And what is burdening me the most about that is that there are people who don't feel that they have to do anything extra when they have experienced trauma. Trauma by its nature, again, is that it's just not a regular occurrence. This is something that is, more intense in nature that we experience, and it usually can overwhelm our natural coping mechanisms, and sometimes it requires of us more response when we have experienced trauma. So that is one of the things that I wanted to start talking about. I feel like I'm a missionary on this field, this traumatic field where people are experiencing so much trauma in our lives personally, and we're experiencing some things culturally. We're experiencing some things as geographically. So there are just so many ways that trauma is impacting us almost on a daily basis, and we really just need to understand trauma, the nature of trauma, and how it impacts us. So I thought today what I was going to do was spend some time talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, or as we may know it, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so many times people have associated this with veterans, people who have been on in war zones and the such. But truth of the matter is, all of us can experience post-traumatic stress disorder depending on the nature of experiences that we have had in our own lives. So today's video is just going to be I'm not going to give a lot of information simply because of the fact that post-traumatic stress disorder in and of itself can be overwhelming to understand. It's overwhelming when we experience it, but it's also very overwhelming to understand. So I think what I am going to do is try to break this down into little bite-sized portions where we will be able to understand it like a little bit at a time, as opposed to me just giving you a lot of information about post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Because it's very complex and it can be very complicated, and I don't want to overwhelm, because I definitely want for us to understand this. I want for us to be able to identify if we have been experiencing PTSD, or if there's a loved one or a friend or family member that could also be experiencing it as well. Okay, so one of the things that I'm going to start off talking to you about is, when does post-traumatic stress disorder take place? So according to our diagnostic and statistical manual, it talks about when we have been exposed to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in various ways. Okay, so it could be that we could directly experience the event, we can witness the event, We can learn of a traumatic event that has occurred to a close family member or a close friend. Sometimes it can be the actual or threatened death of a family member that has been a violent situation or accidental. Or it can also be that we have experienced repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. Okay, so I'm going to go back over that a little bit slowly, a little bit more slowly, and this is really all I'm just going to focus on today. So again, we can understand it doesn't mean that if this has happened, you are automatically going to have PTSD. But I want you to understand that if these things have occurred in your life, that you very well may need to start being aware and observant to determine whether or not you might be experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. So again, what is post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD? It is when we have been exposed to an actual or a threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, okay? And these are some examples in which those things can happen. When we have directly experienced the traumatic event, when we have witnessed it in person as it has occurred to someone else. So if we see something taking place to someone else, this can also be one of the ways that we have been exposed to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence. We can learn of a traumatic event that has happened to a close family member or close friend, okay? And sometimes it can be actual or threatened death, all right? So I want to make sure that we understand that sometimes it doesn't have to mean that the person actually died, but the threat of death can also create the environment where post-traumatic stress disorder may be prevalent. And it also has to be something that was violent or accidental, okay? The next one can be, the last one is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. Okay, so if it's a video that plays and it kind of we see it over and over again, that can be a way that we are experiencing the repeated exposure to something that has been adverse. Okay, when we have to kind of keep hearing the details of it, or if it's an investigation, and unfortunately if you are a witness or a victim and you're having to kind of repeat this story, that can be experiencing the repeated or the extreme exposure to something that has been adverse. All right. So again, as I was saying, I'm just going to leave it right there just to give that much. I mean, even when you hear that, I mean, even just kind of reading my notes, it's a lot. It's already like, oh my goodness, because for those of us who again have experienced something traumatic, is automatically making us begin to think, I wonder, was it that car accident, or when I lost, a friend or a family member in that traumatic or in that horrific accident, or people are lost to gun violence. People are, as the definition says, we can hear about someone who has been sexually violated. There are so many ways that the environment can become conducive to post-traumatic stress disorder, being a reality in our lives. And I just wanted to start off a little bit by helping us to understand what are those events that can be conducive to post-traumatic stress disorder being a reality, that it might be something that we are experiencing. Okay, so just real quickly, I'm going to read over that again. Post-traumatic stress disorder: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence. Those some examples of that is that when we directly experience the event, when we witness in person the event, when we learn of the event that has occurred to a close family member or a friend, and again, that can be actual or threatened death, okay, by something that has been very violent or accidental, and experiencing the repeated or extreme exposure to those adverse details of that event. Alrighty, so that's just a little information to get us started with understanding what post-traumatic stress disorder is and how it looks in our lives and how it begins. Like what events and what situations can occur that are the precursors for post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe being something that we are experiencing, and it might be unbeknownst to us that that's what's kind of going on with us. Okay, so thank you again for tuning in as we are diving into trauma and making certain that we understand trauma and how it does impact our lives, and it does impact our lives, and it is just crucial that we understand it, because the earlier that we have intervention, the better we can fare over time. What ends up happening sometimes is that we just kind of say we can make it, we'll be okay in due time. And if we have a traumatic event that we haven't resolved and we haven't processed, and then if we're exposed to something else, then it keeps layering on top of each other, like layer after layer, trauma after trauma, and those experiences become all the more embedded in our beings, and it then requires more intensive interventions when it just comes to the place where we can no longer ignore the impact of the trauma on our beings. Okay, so thank you again for tuning in. This is Trauma on Thursdays. We're talking post-traumatic stress disorder today. We're just breaking it down and just beginning to talk about what are the precursors that can set us up to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. And next time we'll come back. What we'll talk about is some of the impact, some of the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder on us, so that we can begin to understand if we are experiencing certain things, it very well may be this is symptomatic of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, thank you again for tuning in with me on today. You can follow me on Twitter at Transforming Visions, on Instagram at Transforming Visions, or on Facebook. So looking forward to spending time with you again. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.